This is episode 3 of the Chronicle Arcanum Iran series. Episode 1 covered the 1953 CIA coup that destroyed Iran's democracy. Episode 2 covered the Shah's 26 years of American-backed rule. This episode covers what happens when you spend 26 years torturing a population. You get 1979. The through line of this series is not about religion. It is not about Islam versus the West. It is about cause and effect. About how the decisions made in boardrooms and intelligence offices ripple outward across decades and continents and eventually come back as something no one planned for and no one can control. The 1979 Iranian Revolution is one of the most misunderstood events of the 20th century. In the West, it is remembered as the moment Iran went mad. The moment a modern, secular, westernizing nation was seized by fanatics in black turbans. That is not what happened. What happened was more complicated, more human, and far more instructive for understanding the world we are living in right now. Prologue, The Man on the Plane. January 16, 1979. Tehran International Airport. A man walks across the tarmac in a military uniform covered in medals. He moves slowly. He is 59 years old, and he has been ill for months, though almost no one in Iran knows this yet. His face is the face of someone who has already understood something that the people around him have not. That he is not coming back. He boards the Boeing 707. He takes his seat, and as the plane lifts off the runway and banks away from the city where he was born, where he was raised, where he was installed by a CIA operation 26 years earlier, where he has ruled with an iron fist ever since, he weeps. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the King of Kings, the light of the Aryans, the man the Americans called their most important ally in the Middle East, is leaving Iran forever. Below him, in the streets of Tehran, millions of people are celebrating. They are not celebrating because a great leader has departed. They are celebrating because a nightmare is ending. 26 years of secret police. 26 years of torture chambers. 26 years of people disappearing in the night and coming back broken or not coming back at all. 26 years of a government that was nominally Iranian but functioned as an instrument of foreign interests. 26 years of a deal that was made in 1953 without the Iranian people's knowledge or consent. The Shah is leaving. The people have won. Or so they believe. What they do not yet know, what none of them know, not the students, not the communists, not the feminists, not the nationalists, not even most of the clerics, is that the revolution they fought for is already being taken from them. That the man waiting to return from exile in Paris is not the figure of liberation they imagine him to be. That in 2 years, most of the people who made this revolution will be in prison, in exile, or dead. This is Chronicle Arcanum. This is the revolution that devoured its own children. Act 1, The Pressure Cooker. Chapter 1, What the Shah Built and What It Cost. To understand why the revolution happened, you need to understand what Iran looked like in the 1970s. On the surface, it looked like progress. Tehran in 1975 was a city of highways and high-rises. It had universities. It had a film industry. It had women in miniskirts walking down Pahlavi Avenue. It had a middle class that ate at restaurants, drove cars, and sent its children to study in Paris, London, and New York. The Shah had a plan. He called it the White Revolution. Land reform, women's suffrage, industrial development, literacy programs. He wanted to transform Iran from a feudal society into a modern nation-state in a single generation. Some of it worked. Literacy rates rose. Infrastructure improved. Oil revenues poured in, especially after 1973 when OPEC quadrupled oil prices and Iran's income exploded almost overnight. The Shah announced that by the year 2000, Iran would be among the 5 most powerful nations on Earth. Jimmy Carter stood in the Shah's palace on New Year's Eve 1977 and called Iran an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. An island of stability. Carter said this in December 1977. 14 months later, the Shah was on that plane. Here is what Carter did not see, or chose not to see. The modernization was real, but it was also deeply unequal. The oil wealth flowed to the top. The urban middle class benefited. The rural poor, the urban working class, the bazaar merchants whose traditional livelihoods were being disrupted by Western-style imports, they felt the modernization as displacement, not progress. The Shah's court was ostentatious in a way that offended ordinary Iranians deeply. In 1971, he threw a celebration at the ruins of Persepolis to mark the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. Guests flew in from around the world. The champagne was flown in from France. The food was catered by Maxims of Paris. The bill was estimated at $200 million. In a country where tens of millions of people live in poverty. And underneath all of it, underneath the highways and the universities and the champagne, was SAVAK. The Seizmeni Etelat Va Amniati Keshvar. The Organization of Intelligence and National Security. Iran's secret police. Trained by the CIA, advised by Mossad. And by the mid-1970s, according to Amnesty International, operating one of the most sophisticated torture apparatuses in the world. Chapter 2. What SAVAK did. This chapter is difficult to write and difficult to hear. But it is necessary. Because the revolution of 1979 did not come from nowhere. It came from this. From what SAVAK did to Iranian men and women in the basements of Evin prison and detention centers across the country. From what the regime was willing to do to maintain control. SAVAK's estimates of how many Iranians it employed as agents and informers range from 15,000 to 150,000, depending on the source. It had informers in universities, in mosques, in factories, in bazaars, in government offices. An informer might be your colleague, your neighbor, your cousin. The result was a society of pervasive, low-grade terror. People did not know who could be trusted. Political discussion happened in whispers, if at all. Criticism of the Shah, even in private, could result in a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. And if that knock came, what followed was documented in detail by Amnesty International, by the International Commission of Jurists, by journalists who managed to speak to survivors. Electric shocks. Applied to fingers. To toes. To genitals. Sleep deprivation. Prisoners kept awake for days until they no longer knew what was real. Suspension. Prisoners hung from their arms or legs for hours, sometimes days. Beating. Systematic. calibrated to cause maximum pain without killing. Mock executions. Prisoners taken out, blindfolded, made to kneel, a gun placed against their head, and the trigger pulled on an empty chamber. Solitary confinement. Months. Years. Some prisoners were held for a decade in cells small enough that they could not lie down flat. Amnesty International's 1974 report stated that Iran had the highest number of political prisoners and the most active torture program of any country in the world. The Shah, when asked about this by journalists, denied it. Said it was an exaggeration. Said his opponents were communists and terrorists who deserved what they got. His allies in Washington looked away. Because Iran was stable. Because the Shah bought American weapons. Because the oil flowed. Because in the calculus of Cold War geopolitics, a reliable authoritarian was worth more than an unreliable democrat. The people of Iran were paying the price for that calculus. And they were keeping count. Chapter 3. The Opposition, a coalition that should not have worked. Here is the thing about the Iranian Revolution that surprises most people when they study it carefully. It was not an Islamic revolution in its origins. The movement that overthrew the Shah was one of the broadest political coalitions in modern history. It included groups that had nothing in common with each other, groups that, in normal times, would have been each other's enemies. There were the communists and Marxists. The Tud Party and its offshoots, which had been driven underground by SAVAK for decades. These were people who wanted a socialist state, who hated American imperialism, who saw the Shah as a tool of global capitalism. They were secular, educated, deeply ideological. There were the liberal nationalists, the heirs of Mossadegh, lawyers, intellectuals, professors, doctors, the people who believed in parliamentary democracy, in the rule of law, in a sovereign Iran that controlled its own resources. They were secular, moderate, and deeply committed to the idea of constitutional government. There were the feminists, women who had achieved significant gains under the Shah, university education, the right to vote, legal protections, but who lived in a police state and understood that those gains meant nothing without basic political freedom. There were the urban poor, the millions of migrants from rural areas who had moved to Tehran and other cities looking for work in the oil economy boom and found instead overcrowded slums, impossible rents, and the contempt of a society that looked down on them. There were the bazaris, the traditional merchant class, whose centuries-old trading networks were being disrupted by the Shah's westernization program, had deep ties to the mosques and the clergy. And there were the Islamists, the followers of Khomeini and other clerics who wanted an Islamic state. They were the most organized. They had the mosques, which functioned as the only spaces SAVAK could not fully infiltrate. They had networks. They had money from the bazaris. They had a clear ideology. But in 1977, in 1978, they were a minority within the revolution. The revolution belonged to everyone. And that is the tragedy of what comes next. Act 2, the year everything burned. Chapter 4. In 1977, the pressure cracks. The revolution did not begin with a gunshot or a bomb. It began with a poem. In the autumn of 1977, a group of Iranian writers published an open letter to the government. 10 writers, demanding freedom of expression, demanding the end of censorship, demanding that the government follow its own constitution, They were not revolutionaries. They were asking for things that the Iranian constitution already technically guaranteed. SAVAK arrested some of them. Others lost their jobs. The government's response to a polite letter asking for legal rights was repression. And something shifted. The repression had always worked before. Fear had always quieted dissent. But in 1977, something was different. Jimmy Carter had come to power in Washington talking about human rights. The Shah, sensitive to American opinion, had loosened the reins very slightly. And that loosening was enough. Once people saw that protest was possible, that you could sign your name to a letter criticizing the government and not immediately disappear, others came forward. More letters. More gatherings. More voices. In October 1977, a series of poetry readings was held in Tehran at the Goethe Institute, the German Cultural Center. They were supposed to be literary events. They became something else. Thousands of people crowded in to hear poets read works that challenged the regime. Outside, thousands more who could not get in listened through open windows. The Shah's regime looked at the gatherings and saw culture. They should have seen a fuse being lit. Then, in November 1977, something happened that had nothing to do with Iran but everything to do with what came next. Ali Shariati died. Shariati was an Iranian intellectual, a sociologist, a thinker who had spent years developing a framework that fused Shia Islam with anti-colonialism and social justice. He was not Khomeini. He was not calling for a clerical state. He was calling for a revolutionary, egalitarian Islam that could liberate the Third World from imperialism. His death, whether from a heart attack or something SAVAK did, which was never established, made him a martyr. His book spread everywhere. His vision of a politically active, justice-seeking Islam gave millions of Iranians a language for revolution that felt both modern and rooted in their own culture. He was the revolution's philosopher. He did not live to see what the revolution became. Chapter 5: The Cinema Rex Fire, and the Lie That Accelerated Everything. August 19, 1978. Abadan, a city in the oil-rich southwest of Iran. The Cinema Rex was a movie theater showing a film that evening. It was a full house. Somewhere between 370 and 420 people were inside. Someone locked the doors from the outside. Someone poured gasoline. Someone set it on fire. The people inside could not get out. They burned. They suffocated. They died trying to break through locked emergency exits. The final death toll was officially between 370 and over 400, one of the deadliest acts of arson in modern history. Immediately, in the streets, the answer was obvious to everyone: SAVAK did it. The regime denied it. Blamed outside agitators. Blamed communists. Blamed enemies of the state. The denial made it worse. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets of Abadan and other cities. Factories went on strike. Bazaars closed. Here is the historical footnote that only emerged years later. The fire at Cinema Rex was set by members of an Islamist group, not SAVAK. The perpetrators were eventually identified and tried after the revolution. But the regime's lie, its immediate, reflexive denial and counter-accusation, meant that no one believed the truth when it finally came out. SAVAK had spent 26 years lying. SAVAK had spent 26 years torturing and killing people and then denying it. Why would anyone believe him now? The government had destroyed its own credibility so thoroughly that even when it told the truth, no one could hear it. That is what sustained institutional lying does. It poisons the well so deeply that truth and lies become indistinguishable. And in that environment, the most coherent narrative, the one with the clearest villain, wins. The clearest villain was the Shah. Chapter 6, Black Friday, The Point of No Return. September 8, 1978. It became known as Black Friday. Martial law had been declared in Tehran and 11 other cities the night before, suddenly, with almost no warning. The curfew order went out late. Many people did not know about it. The next morning, a large crowd gathered in Jailer Square in Tehran. They were protesters, yes. But they were also people who simply did not know that gathering was now illegal. Government forces opened fire. The official government figure was 87 dead. Opposition groups claimed thousands. The real number, established by later historians, was somewhere between 200 and 500 people killed. Shot in a public square on a September morning. Whatever slim possibility existed of a negotiated settlement between the Shah's regime and the reform movement, whatever chance there was that the pressure could be released without the whole system exploding, died in Jailer Square on September 8, 1978. From that day forward, it was not a protest movement. It was a revolution. The moderate nationalists, the liberals, the people who had been hoping for reform within the system, after Jailer Square, most of them concluded that the system could not reform itself. That it had to go. The Shah had closed every door except one. Chapter 7, Khomeini, the man in the background. While all of this was happening in Iran, an old man was sitting in a house in Neaufle-le-Château, a small village outside Paris. He had been in exile since 1964. 14 years. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. He was 76 years old. He wore black robes and a black turban. He did not smile in photographs. He had spent decades developing a theological framework called Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, supreme political authority should rest with a qualified Islamic scholar. In other words, a cleric should rule. This was, to put it gently, a controversial interpretation. Most Shia Muslim scholars did not agree with it. The traditional Shia view had always been that clerics should guide society, not govern it directly. Velayat-e-Faqih was Khomeini's own innovation. A significant theological departure. But from his house in France, Khomeini had something that no one else in the opposition had. He had a clear message, delivered in a voice like a grinding millstone. Down with the Shah. Not, reform the Shah. Not, negotiate with the Shah. Not, limit the Shah. Down with the Shah. In a political landscape full of factions with complicated platforms and internal divisions, that simplicity was a kind of power. And he had the technology of 1978 working for him in a way that no revolutionary leader before him had experienced. Cassette tapes. Khomeini's sermons and speeches were recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran by the thousands. Tape players were everywhere. the tapes were copied and passed from hand to hand. SAVAK tried to stop it but could not. The Shah's government had built modern infrastructure, roads, electricity, factories, and that infrastructure made it possible to distribute revolutionary content faster than any previous regime in history had faced. It was a technology that changed politics forever. A few years later, the technology would be the internet. But in 1978, it was the cassette tape. And Khomeini's voice was on every one of them. He was careful about what he said. Remarkably careful. He did not talk about Velayat-e Faqih on those tapes. He did not describe his plan for an Islamic republic. He talked about the Shah, about tyranny, about dignity, about the Iranian people's right to self-determination. He was saying what everyone wanted to hear. The communists heard anti-imperialism. The nationalists heard sovereignty. The liberals heard democracy. The devout heard Islam. He was everything to everyone because he was saying nothing specific. That, too, was a kind of genius. Act 3, The Fall. Chapter 8, The Shah's Collapse. By the autumn of 1978, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was a man in the grip of two crises simultaneously. The external crisis was obvious. His country was coming apart. Strikes were paralyzing the economy. Oil workers walked out, the most devastating blow of all, because the oil revenue was the entire basis of the state's power. The streets of Tehran were filled, day after day, with crowds of hundreds of thousands demanding his departure. The internal crisis was secret. The Shah was dying. He had been diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia in 1974. A small group of doctors and advisors knew. His wife knew. His American handlers knew. The Iranian people did not know. And the illness was doing something to him beyond the physical deterioration. It was affecting his judgment, his decisiveness, his ability to project the confidence and ruthlessness that had kept him in power. Throughout 1978, as the crisis escalated, the Shah made a series of decisions that baffled his advisors and his enemies alike. He was too harsh and then too soft. He declared martial law and then failed to enforce it. He promised reforms and then made no reforms. He appointed new prime ministers and then undercut them. He called for dialogue and then arrested the people who came to dialogue. He could neither fully repress the revolution nor fully accommodate it. He oscillated between the two positions without committing to either. His SAVAK chief, General Nematollah Nasiri, pleaded for permission to move decisively against the opposition leadership. To arrest them. To break the movement before it reached critical mass. The Shah hesitated. His American advisors sent conflicting signals. Some told him to reform. Others told him to crack down. Washington was divided. Carter's human rights rhetoric had genuinely constrained the Shah's options. He knew that a major massacre would cost him American support, and without American support, he had nothing. He was caught between his illness, his indecision, and the impossible position his American patrons had put him in. He had built a system that could only function through fear. And when the moment came when fear required decisive brutality, he could not deliver it. Or would not. It is still not entirely clear which. Chapter 9, The Last Days, November and December 1978. November 1978. The revolution had reached its endgame. In the city of Isfahan, the army refused to fire on protesters. Soldiers embraced demonstrators. Flowers were placed in rifle barrels. The image went around the world. It was the end. An army that will not shoot is not an army. The Shah appointed a series of prime ministers in rapid succession, each one a signal of desperation. He appointed Sharif Emami, who tried to negotiate with the clergy. He appointed General Azari, a military man, to impose order. Azari promptly had a heart attack. He appointed Shopur Bakhshir, a liberal nationalist from Mossadegh's old movement, as his final prime minister, a gesture so late and so insufficient that it satisfied no one. Bakhshir took the job on one condition: the Shah had to leave. The Shah agreed. On December the 10th and 11th, 1978, the holy days of Ashura, the Shia Muslim commemoration of the martyrdom of Hussein, somewhere between 6 and 9 million people marched in Tehran alone. 6 to 9 million people. In a single city. It is one of the largest human gatherings in recorded history. They were marching against the Shah. He was already gone in everything but body. January 16, 1979. He boards the plane. He weeps. The streets of Tehran explode in celebration. 16 days later, on February 1st, a chartered Air France Boeing 747 lands at Mehrabad Airport. Khomeini is home. 2 million people line the streets from the airport to the city. A journalist asks Khomeini, on the plane, "What do you feel, returning to Iran after 15 years in exile?" Khomeini looks at the journalist. "Nothing," he says. "Hitch." Nothing. It was the most chilling word in the history of Iranian politics. Chapter 10. 10 days, the revolution is won. The 10 days between Khomeini's return on February 1st and the final collapse of the monarchy on February 11th are known in Iran simply as Dar-e-Fajr. The 10 days of dawn. They moved fast. Khomeini appointed a parallel government immediately. He named Mehdi Bazargan as the prime minister of a provisional revolutionary government. Bazargan was a liberal, an engineer, a man who had been a close associate of Mossadegh. His appointment was a signal, deliberate and calculated, that this was not going to be an authoritarian theocracy. This was going to be a modern republic with Islamic values. It was a lie. Or at least, it was not the whole truth. But it was what the coalition needed to hear to hold together for 10 more days. The Shah's military had declared neutrality a death sentence for any regime. Without the military, there was no regime. On February 10th, Homafaran, Iranian Air Force technicians, declared their support for the revolution. Armed groups seized weapons from military arsenals. Firefights broke out between Imperial Guard units and revolutionary militias. Radio stations were seized. February 11th, 1979. The Supreme Military Council announced that the armed forces would remain neutral in the struggle between the government and the people. The monarchy of 2,500 years, Cyrus to Darius to the Pahlavis, was over. The Islamic Republic of Iran did not yet exist. For a few weeks, Iran existed in a kind of revolutionary suspension. Power belonged to no one. Power belonged to everyone. The streets hummed with possibility. The students were planning universities. The feminists were planning women's rights organizations. The communists were planning workers' councils. The liberals were planning elections. Everyone was planning. And Khomeini was watching. Act 4 of the theft. Chapter 11, The Constitution, What Was Promised and What Was Written. A referendum was held in March 1979. The question on the ballot was simple: Islamic Republic, yes or no? 98% voted yes. But here is what was not on the ballot: what kind of Islamic Republic? The phrase Islamic Republic meant different things to different people. To the liberals, it meant a republic with elections, a parliament, an independent judiciary that drew inspiration from Islamic values. To the nationalists, it meant Iran free from foreign domination, with Islam as the cultural foundation. To the socialists, it meant social justice, which they associated with Islamic principles of equality. To Khomeini and his inner circle, it meant Velayat-e Faqih, clerical rule. A supreme leader with final authority over all branches of government. The drafting of the Constitution became the first battlefield. The initial draft produced by a council in the summer of 1979 was relatively moderate. It established a republic with a president, a parliament, and an independent judiciary. The role of the clergy was significant but not absolute. Velayat-e Faqih was not in the first draft. Then Khomeini intervened. He insisted on the creation of an assembly of experts to revise the constitution. The assembly was elected in a process that systematically excluded secular and leftist candidates. Candidates had to be vetted for Islamic credentials. The result was a body dominated by clerics. The assembly rewrote the constitution from scratch. Velayat-e Faqih was inserted at the center of the new document. The supreme leader, who would be Khomeini, had authority over the military, the judiciary, the intelligence services, and the power to override any decision made by any elected body. The republic was there. The president was there. The parliament was there. But above all of them was the guardian. Above all of them was God's representative on earth. It was a democracy with a permanent veto built in at the top. And by the time most Iranians understood what had been written, the constitution had been ratified, and the process of consolidation had begun. Chapter 12: How the Revolution Ate Its Own. The clerical faction moved methodically and without hesitation. They understood something the other factions did not, that in the chaos of a revolution, the group that moves fastest to seize the instruments of coercion wins everything. The instruments of coercion were the new revolutionary institutions. The Revolutionary Guards, the Pasdaran, were established almost immediately after the revolution. Separate from the regular army, loyal directly to Khomeini, heavily armed. They were the new SAVAK, the new private army of the ruling faction. The revolutionary committees, the comites, appeared in every neighborhood. Young men with guns, empowered by religious authority, are enforcing a new moral and political order. Women were told to cover their hair. Music was restricted. Alcohol was banned. Mixed-gender gatherings were monitored. This was not the revolution the feminists had marched for. Not the revolution the students had demanded. The protests began almost immediately. March 1979. International Women's Day. Thousands of women marched in Tehran against the new hijab requirements. They had marched in the revolution. They had suffered under SAVAK. And now the new government was telling them what to wear. Khomeini's response was swift and cold. He called the protesters westernized. He said their demonstrations were the work of imperialist influence. He said women who did not observe proper Islamic dress had no place in the new Iran. It was the first time the revolutionary coalition understood clearly that the faction that had taken power was not speaking for all of them. It would not be the last. Through 1979 and into 1980, the process continued. The liberal nationalists, Bazagan's government, found themselves systematically undercut. The Comitas operated outside their authority. The Revolutionary Guards answered to Khomeini, not to the elected government. The parallel structures of clerical power made the official government a fiction. Bazagan resigned in November 1979, after revolutionary students seized the American embassy and he realized he had no ability to control anything. He said, on his way out, "I am a knife without a blade." The leftists lasted longer. The Mojahini-Khalq, the Fidayeen, the Tud Party, they had guns, they had organization, they had fighters who had battled SAVAK for years. They believed they were partners in the revolution. They believed Khomeini when he spoke of social justice. They believed, or hoped, that the clerical faction would accept a coalition government. The clerical faction had no intention of accepting a coalition government. The crackdown on the left began in earnest in 1981. The Mojahideen launched a violent campaign against the new government after it became clear they would never be allowed a share of power. The government responded with mass arrests, mass executions, and a campaign of repression that in its scope and speed made SAVAK look almost restrained. Thousands were executed in 1981 and 1982. Thousands more in 1988, in what became known as the prison massacres, a systematic killing of political prisoners, most of them leftists who had already been in prison for years, ordered by Khomeini in the final months of the Iran-Iraq War. The exact number of people killed in the 1988 massacre is still disputed. Estimates range from 2,000 to 30,000. Khomeini never acknowledged it. He died in June 1989, 8 months after signing the order. The revolution had succeeded. The revolution had failed. Both things were true. The Shah was gone. That was real. That was what almost everyone had wanted. But what replaced him was not freedom. It was a different kind of theocratic authoritarianism, one that spoke the language of Islam instead of the language of monarchy, one that had popular legitimacy instead of American backing, but one that used torture chambers and executions and surveillance and fear with the same cold efficiency as SAVAK. It just had a different name for the people it was torturing. Enemies of God instead of communists and terrorists. The furniture had changed. The room was the same. Act 5, The Hostages and the World. Chapter 13, 444 Days. November 4th, 1979. 520 Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran. They called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They were young. They were ideologically committed to Khomeini. And they had a plan, or at least, they had an idea. The Shah had been admitted to the United States for medical treatment. This, to the revolutionary students, was intolerable. The man who had spent 26 years torturing their parents and siblings and friends was being sheltered by the very country that had installed him. They wanted him back. They wanted him put on trial. They wanted Iran to look the United States in the eye and say, "Your time here is over." They seized 66 American diplomats and held them for 444 days. The hostage crisis changed everything. In Iran, it transformed the political landscape. The students who seized the embassy had acted without government authorization. Bazargan's government, horrified, tried to negotiate the release and then resigned when it became clear that Khomeini would not back them. Khomeini endorsed the seizure, and in doing so, he handed the clerical faction a perfect political weapon. Anyone who wanted to negotiate the release of the hostages could be accused of being an American agent. Anyone who criticized the seizure was a counter-revolutionary. The hostage crisis created a siege mentality that shut down internal political debate at exactly the moment when the constitutional struggle was at its most critical. It was tactically brilliant. Whether it was consciously designed as such is debated by historians. But it worked. In America, the hostage crisis defined the revolution. 52 Americans held captive. The nightly news is counting the days. Jimmy Carter was destroyed politically. Ronald Reagan won the election in a landslide. There is a historical footnote to the hostage crisis that was not fully established for years. Reagan's campaign had secret contacts with Iranian representatives in the summer and fall of 1980. The suggestion, which has been documented through multiple sources, including congressional investigation, was that Iran should delay releasing the hostages until after the American election. That releasing them before the election would help Carter, and that a Republican president would be more favorable to Iran's interests. The hostages were released on January 20, 1981, the exact day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Within minutes of him taking the oath of office. Whether this was a coincidence or an arrangement, this too has never been fully established to the satisfaction of all historians. But the timing is what it is. Chapter 14, The Iran-Iraq War, The Revolution's Dark Gift. September 22, 1980. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, ordered his army to invade Iran. He had many reasons, or believed he did. The Shatt al-Arab waterway dispute. The Kurdish problem. Iranian support for the Shia opposition in Iraq. But the primary reason was simpler than any of those. He thought Iran was weak. The revolution had decimated the Iranian military. The Shah's American-trained officer corps had been purged, many executed, many more fled into exile. The military was in chaos. The country was consumed by internal political struggles. This was the moment, Saddam believed, to seize the oil-rich region of Khuzestan and perhaps trigger the collapse of a government he feared and despised. He was wrong. The invasion of Iran did not collapse the Islamic Republic. It saved it. Nothing unifies a population like a foreign invasion. The political struggles that had been tearing the revolution apart, the fights between factions, the crackdown on the left, the constitutional crisis, all of it was suddenly secondary to national survival. Millions of young Iranians volunteered for the front. Boys as young as 12 and 13 were given keys, plastic keys, painted gold, and told that if they died in battle, they would use the keys to open the gates of paradise. They walked into minefields. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years. It killed between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides. It became one of the most brutal conflicts since World War II. And throughout most of it, the United States backed Iraq. Satellite intelligence was shared with Saddam. American companies sold dual-use technology. When Saddam used chemical weapons on Iranian troops and on Kurdish civilians, the Reagan administration knew and said nothing publicly. The Washington Post reported years later, citing declassified documents, that American intelligence officials provided targeting data to the Iraqi military even when analysts knew the Iraqis were using chemical agents against Iranian troop formations. The United States knew and continued to help. This is the history that Iranians know. This is the history that explains why, when American politicians speak of the Iranian government as uniquely evil, as a uniquely destabilizing force, as a regime that cannot be trusted, the Iranian government and the Iranian people have a very specific set of documents to point to. The documents that show who sold the weapons, who trained the torturers, who backed the dictator who gassed them. History does not excuse anything the Islamic Republic has done. History does not justify terrorism, hostage-taking, or the execution of political prisoners. But the history is the history. And it does not begin in 1979. It begins in 1953. Epilogue: What the Revolution Left Behind. There is a woman named Vida Mouvaid. In December 2017, she stood on a utility box on Ingelab Street in Tehran, Revolution Street, named for the revolution of 1979, and removed her white hijab. She tied it to a stick. She held it up in the air and stood there, silent, while the people around her filmed it on their phones. She was arrested within minutes. She had done nothing except refuse to wear what she was required by law to wear. Her image spread across the internet. She became a symbol. Other women followed her. The White Wednesdays movement. Women across Iran are standing on utility boxes, removing their headscarves, holding them on sticks, and being arrested. For years later, in September 2022, a 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in police custody 3 days later. Iran erupted. This time it was different. The protests spread faster than anything since 1979. They reached every province, every city, every social class. The slogan was 3 words in Persian: Zon, Zendegi, Azadi. Woman. Life. Freedom. Not the old slogans of the communist left. Not the religious rhetoric of the clerical right. Something new. Something that cut across every political division. Woman. Life. Freedom. The government cracked down with familiar tools. Arrests. Executions. Torture. Surveillance. The same tools SAVAK had used. The same tools that had filled the prisons before 1979. The same tools that had made the revolution inevitable in the first place. As of this recording, the protests have not succeeded in overthrowing the Islamic Republic. But they have not stopped either. The revolution of 1979 promised freedom from the Shah's tyranny. It delivered a different tyranny. And the people who are standing on utility boxes and holding their headscarves in the air they are the daughters and granddaughters of the people who made the revolution. The people who marched against SAVAK. The people who believed that the worst was behind them. They are still waiting for the promise that was made in 1979 and was stolen before the year was out. The final question. Here is what the Iranian Revolution teaches us. It is not about Islam, or about the Middle East, or about any specific culture or religion or people. It is about what happens when the people who make a revolution are not the people who take power afterward. It happened in France. The revolution of 1789 devoured its own. The moderates were guillotined. The radicals were guillotined. Eventually, Napoleon walked in and said, "I will end the chaos." France accepted. It happened in Russia. The Bolsheviks did not win the revolution of 1917. They won the civil war that came after it. The people who actually made the revolution, the socialists, the peasants, the workers, found themselves in the gulags within a decade. It happened in China. It happened in Cuba. It happened in Nicaragua. And it happened in Iran in 1979. The lesson is not that revolution is impossible or that change cannot come. The lesson is that the moment the common enemy falls is the most dangerous moment of all. Because that is the moment when the coalition that was held together by shared hatred of what was, that coalition dissolves. And in its place, the factions that were unified by a common enemy become enemies of each other. And in that chaos, whoever has the guns wins. Whoever has the clearest ideology wins. Whoever is willing to do what others will not do wins. In Iran in 1979, that was Khomeini. He had the ideology. He had the mosques. He had the organizational structure. He had the Revolutionary Guards. And he had the absolute conviction that God was on his side, a conviction that made compromise not just unnecessary but sinful. The liberals had ideas. The leftists had passion. The feminists had courage. Khomeini had power. And when the dust settled, power was what mattered. But the story does not end here. Because the Islamic Republic that emerged from the ruins of the Shah's regime was not the end of Iranian history. It was the beginning of another chapter. The war with Iraq. The nuclear program. The sanctions. The assassinations, cyber attacks, and proxy wars. The Green Movement. The protests after massacre. The death of Khamenei in February 2026. The man in a suit waiting in Maryland. The same question, returning in a different form. Who decides what Iran is? Is it the clerics who took power in 1979? Is it the diaspora who fled and spent decades in American think tanks? Is it the 90 million people who woke up on March 1st, 2026, in a country whose government had just been destroyed by bombs they had no vote in dropping? The revolution of 1979 answered that question with force, ideology, and fast movement. What comes next will answer it again. The only question is whether those 90 million people will get to be part of that answer. Or whether someone else, as in 1953, as in 1979, will write their answer for them. This is Chronicle Arcanum. The past is not behind us. It is the argument we have not finished having.